Welcome everyone to Crafting a Slam Dunk Hook, or How to Seduce an Agent, Editor, Audience, Publish Your Book, and Have Your Own Happily Ever After. I'm really glad everyone could be here. This is my absolute favorite workshop to give. I've given it with my former colleague, Kat Klein, who helped me create this presentation, just up and down the coast, all kinds of different conferences. So shout out to her before we begin, and let's go ahead and get started. So our marketers asked me if I could please ask you to be a total tweetheart and consider tweeting about the workshop and using that hashtag and tag us at Sourcebook Casa. We would really appreciate it. Okay, so introductions. Who are we? Who am I? And why do I have the authority to talk to you right now? Well, basically, my name is Mary Altman. I'm a senior editor at Sourcebooks Casablanca. I've been an editor for about 11 and a half years now, and I've been with Sourcebooks for over 6 years. I do sign primarily romance. However, within the last couple of years, my list has really widened. So now I also sign young adult, some mystery, and I'm also the Sourcebooks horror editor at this moment because I've always loved to read horror, but a little thing some people don't know about me is that I absolutely cannot watch it. I have terrible nightmares if I actually see the visuals, but I cannot read it fast enough. So that's just a little bit of quirk about me. I lived in New York City for about 10 years, and I am a huge flipping nerd. So if you've met me ever at a conference, you absolutely know this to be true. You also probably know that I'm super shy, but really welcoming. So if you ever see me around, whether it's at conferences again when they open, whether it's just in the street, wherever, go ahead and say hi, and will always be excited to hear about your books. So one of the things that I think underlines Sourcebooks, as I give my quick Sourcebook spiel at the beginning, is this quote by Publishers Weekly: "The future of book publishing is going on right now at Sourcebooks." And that's because Sourcebooks is a truly data-driven company. It is a mid-sized independent. It is one of the top publishers in the US, and it is a company that really believes in its mission statement that books change lives. Books certainly changed my life. I'm sure that you can think of books growing up, books as you were aging, books as you're developing as a person that really impacted who you were as a person. And that's something that our CEO, Dominique, truly believes and lives and just is the drive behind. And that's when she created Sourcebooks, why Sourcebooks was so important to her. And here we believe strongly in the power of story, and also that really it's publishing authors and not books that's key. Authors really, books are important, but it's the author's career, it's the author's voice, it's that connection with the author that readers really come back to again and again. And that's something that we believe very passionately. We are the largest woman-owned independent publishing house, and that's our CEO, Dominique Rocca, in the far left. And then our CASA team is led by Deb Worksman, and then there's me, of course, and then Krista and Rachel Gilmer. So the meat of our presentation today, what we're covering is essentially these key things. What genre are you writing? So that is the building block that I consider the most important thing you really need to know when you're looking to publish your books. What genre are you fitting in? What are you actually writing? And what are the books that are most like yours, so that both your audience and booksellers really know where to put you and where to find you? What is your hook? That's the kind of the big thing that we're selling here, and that's essentially how do you stand out above all the other books. Do you have a series hook? Do you need a frame, and what exactly is a frame? Because people tend to use frame and hook interchangeably, and they are actually two very distinct things. And what is your career arc? And a few thoughts about positioning and how that ties into the hook. So first we're going to start with that building block, the genre and placement. What are you writing, and where will it go, and where will people find it? So the first most important thing to think about when you're thinking about where a book will go is where that audience tends to buy their books and where they're going to be looking for their next book so that you can be their next book. And we've got several avenues that we can take in publishing, whether you're an independent publisher or whether you're working with a traditional publisher. And some of the key ones to think about are print, the mass market. And when I talk about the mass channel, I'm talking things like Walmart, Sam's Club, the big box stores, the grocery store chains. Those are kind of the big places where you go to buy your groceries, your books, and your home goods. Then we have the retail, and that is like your Barnes and Nobles, your Books a Millions, your independent publishers, and books places like that. Your libraries online, and then of course your ebooks. You'll have your Amazons and so on, your ebooks with your Radishes and Wattpad, and then the retails, so this would be like the Nook, and then of course library. And there, again, like I said, scores of other places, places that are audio only, video only, but these are the ones that we're going to be really focusing in on today. And those are, when you're starting to write, you need to really be thinking about, where are my readers most likely to be going to get their books? So where should I be so they can find me? And this is one of my favorite slides because it shows that in a really great way. So what we're seeing are 5 real examples of distribution. We have on the far left, young adult fiction, next to it, Western romance, and then paranormal romance, women's fiction, and contemporary romance. And you can see here that the blue is Amazon print sales, the orange is Barnes & Noble book sales, the purple is Target, the yellow is Walmart in the mass, and green is ebooks, and that pink is library. So for example, you're writing a Western romance. If you were writing a Western romance and you were only publishing online and you only have ebooks, then you're missing a huge chunk of your market. 67% of that Western market would be the mass market alone. So you are only getting about 11% of your full sales potential if you are only in that one space. And you don't really understand that the Western romance reader, not always, there are always exceptions, but typically tends to be a very mass market kind of reader. Whereas if you're writing women's fiction, 52% of those sales are going to be in Target. Target's a very important place for you. The library is going to be a little bit more important, but not as important as it is in YA, for example, in this. Ebooks are still going to be a sizable chunk, but not as big as they are in this paranormal romance example. And I just want to underline that these are examples. There are books, there are careers that are writing in these spaces that are going to look a little bit different, but these are what we're considering to be like pretty ordinary examples of what these kind of genres would look like in action. So as you're thinking about that, it's important to know, especially if you're going for print, where's your book going to sit on the shelf? Because when you're thinking of the bookstore, you're imagining going in and you need to know, kind of to orient yourself in this bookstore, where am I going to find the book that I'm most interested in? And then as you're browsing through that shelf, as you're picking up, say, the next Robin Carr, Isabel Cooper, you happen to spot other books that look really interesting. Those are your competition. Those are the books that sit alongside you. And those are different authors' opportunities to be discovered. So that's why we have in bookstores these kind of genre shelves. And I'm going to talk about crossing genre and how to do that later. But for the most part, when you're starting out, it's very important to have a very clear vision of where your book would fit. And if you're talking fully digital, if your books are only going to be ebook, you still need to know about genre and subgenre, because you need to know what kind of books are the also buys. What are the books that you need to get friendly with those authors and ask for them to blurb for you and for them to talk to their audience about you, because their audience is going to be your audience. So just really thinking about your genre and what your book actually is incredibly key. And the thing that I hear the most often when I'm talking to authors about this is, well, my book's like nothing else out there, which is absolutely true and absolutely valid. Every story is unique, but readers still need to know where they're going to find it. think of genre as like a common language. It's something that we all kind of have an understanding of. We all kind of know what a paranormal romance is. We all kind of know what like haunted house horror is. So even though your book has many unique elements and you're bringing your own voice and your own passion to it, because it has these shared elements with other books, you're able to say like, well, yes, if you love Shirley Jackson and The House on Haunted Hill, you're really going to love my book because it shares this, this, and this. So it allows you to directly talk not only to your readers, but also to publishing professionals and also to the sales forces so that they can sell your books into the different like Barnes & Noble's, Books A Millions, and Indies. So you can bend these rules, you can break them, you can ignore everything that I'm telling you today, but all I ask is that if you're serious about your career, that you do it mindfully and you do it with as much knowledge in your back pocket as you've got. So I'm talking a lot about romance today and using a lot of romance examples, and that's because this presentation was created for romance conferences, but a lot of what I'm saying can be taken and used for other genres, and I'm going to try to throw in other genre examples as we go. So just know that even though sometimes I'll be speaking directly to the romance author, that is not the only person that can learn something from this. So like genres like romance actually have what I like to think of as like a superhero quality, because they have multiple subgenres and sub-subgenres and sub-sub-subgenres, and it just keeps going down and down. You can drill extremely far into genre when it comes to romance. Other genres like mystery have this as well. So you can think of like they have the cozies, they have the thriller, they have domestic thriller, which is different from political thriller. Horror has this. A lot of the true genre fiction tends to have tons of subgenres in its back pocket. For romance, we consider them the 6+ subgenres. So of course you have romantic suspense, contemporary romance, paranormal romance, historical romance, erotic romance, inspirational romance, and then the added women's fiction. And there is a bit of kind of blending between all of them, and there's a bit of blending between these subgenres and say women's fiction that sits on the fiction shelf. What I like to think of the rule of thumb when you're trying to figure out what you're writing is think of it as percentage wise. So if you're writing say a very suspenseful story where there's tons of explosions, tons of danger, there's a terrible bad guy, and there are two characters that are fighting for their lives and they fall in love in the midst of that. How important is that love story to the book, and how much of a percent do you focus on that love story? If that is a high percent, if it is say 60%-ish, then you're writing a romantic suspense. The romance is key, and if you take the romance out, the book does not stand on its own. If the explosions and the mystery and the thrill is more important, and that is 60%, and the romance is a bit less than that, then you're writing a suspense novel with romantic elements, and that will sit on a very different shelf and have very different rules in how it's positioned and how it's published. So what I recommend, if you have any questions about that and you can't figure out exactly how to parse between different genres, is that you read the bigger examples in each of those genres and then try to click on to which of these is most like what I've written. So if you like read some Karen Roses and then some Sharon Salas and then The Girl on the Train, and like you just read across the genres, and then you realize, all right, I have the tempo of a Karen Rose, so she would probably be a good example of how my career should go. That's just a little bit of advice there. But when it comes to genre, subgenre, and sub-subgenre, we also have umbrella subgenres. So paranormal romance is one of those 6+ subgenres, but it is an umbrella for other sub-subgenres. So under paranormal romance, you will have something like fantasy romance, science fiction romance, shifter romance. All of these fit within the paranormal romance umbrella. So there are incredible numbers of these subgenres, and it's useful to know how you fit into this universe. And that's why I'm going to pause on this, because this is one of my favorite slides to kind of illustrate that. And while Entertainment Weekly only chose to focus on 3 of those subgenres, it really does kind of give a quick and fun visual on how they just branch out into interesting constellations, and occasionally how they kind of cross over with each other. As you can see, in historical and paranormal, we have Gothic in common. So I'm just going to pause there because it looks like chat is going exciting. All right. Well, I will let Stephanie keep control of that.
Mary, I cannot.
Yes.
Please kick that person out.
So subgenres, you need to remember that subgenres cycle, and what is super popular at one point is going to have a down moment and at another. So another question I'm asked is, what should I be writing next? And what is the thing that's going to be the breakout book for me? And while editors and agents can kind of give you an idea of what's happening in the moment and what could possibly be happening coming up soon, really the important thing to remember is that if you are writing what you really care about, eventually that is going to be at the top. So right now, rom-com, everyone has definitely seen those really colorful trade papers everywhere. That's kind of sitting at the top. That's king right now. Contemporary and historical romance are also doing well. Historical had been fallow for a very long time, and it's now on the rise. Whereas romantic suspense and erotic romance are having a bit of a downturn right now. So they're a little bit more difficult. It's a little bit harder to get those books to sell and to find your audience. But within a year, that could very easily change. These cycles are constant, and they've always been constant. And with the dawn of self-publishing and independent publishing, cycle has really sped up. So these trends can hit and hit and hit very fast, which means that you also should be very wary about chasing the micro trend. So micro trends could be like the biker romances. That was a big micro trend that happened for a while. Obviously right now we're having a micro trend in horror where it comes to the pandemic romance or pandemic stories. Those are again popping up. Very likely I've heard that zombies might be coming back again because of that. Things kind of tie together. It's like in YA fiction, for a while, vampires were just the best and hottest thing. Everyone wanted paranormal YA, and then it became glutted very quickly. There was just way too much of it. So they kept with their favorites, but then they stopped buying the new stuff. So a way to kind of keep an eye on that for your own writing is write what you love, but also keep an eye on what's selling and what's new and what's debuting. And if you're seeing several YA fantasies all debuting together, you can kind of get a sense of what is going on in the market and what's popular. If you see a giant glut of YA fantasies, you could pretty much guarantee by the time you finish your YA fantasy that the market is probably going to be saturated and you might have a little bit of difficulty. So anyway, that was just something to keep in mind as you're writing. But when you're writing in these crowded subgenres, you could either find a new pond and keep that book in your drawer until you see that cycle again, or you could have a really great hook that makes it stand out and makes it something that even though it's in a crowded subgenre, even though it's a difficult market, it will stand out. So I've been throwing this term hook around a lot, and people always argue about what it actually means. And I'm just here to tell you that I'm absolutely right. So what I'm telling you is the truth. The hook is the 1 to 3 sentence essence of the story. It is what makes this book a must read. There are 2 different kinds of hook, and there is not a value judgment in this, but there's the high concept hook, and that means it's a super short, succinct premise, and the idea is what's selling the story. It's that super earwormy kind of book where you hear the idea and you immediately know exactly what it is and what this book is going to be about, and you don't need to know any more details. You already know that you're in. It's like, okay, it's a grumpy sunshine forced proximity in the Colorado mountains, blah, blah, blah. Got it. I'm in. Low concept hook, on the other hand, is where the character development is more of the driving force than the plot. So these are kind of books where the subtleties aren't easily summarized. When you're describing the book, you find yourself having to talk more about relationships and characters and how they interact with each other. And that's how you know that you have a low concept hook. And again, there's no value judgment. Low concept hooks are not bad, they're just more difficult to sell. So if you find yourself with a low concept hook, it really helps to kind of tease it out and think about what are some high concept ideas that I could weave through this and then sell the idea on the high concept and then keep reader loyalty with my fantastic characters in my low concept hook. And the framing device, which is what's often confused for a hook, is this book is this plus this equals my awesome project. And it is very useful when it comes to kind of having a stickiness when you're talking to editors and agents and salespeople. Basically, we have like the attention of gadflies sometimes. Especially at conferences, there's just so much coming at us. We don't remember everything all the time. But if you give us a really strong frame, then we're more likely to kind of click and remember that frame and then remember your project. And the same things happens in sales calls. Giving a frame lets the book buyers kind of have an instant understanding about what they're working with so that they can quickly get on board and then be very receptive when the sales call then goes on to describe the hook and the idea and the author. So it's not required for a successful pitch. It's not required for a successfully independently published book. You don't have to have it in your copy. It's just something that's kind of an added bonus and can be helpful. So the hook is used essentially to catch the eyes of agents and editors who then use it with submissions. So if an agent signs you and they send me your book, they will send me your hook. And that will be like the top line information. That catches my eye. I take it to my team. We get very excited. We offer for the book. We acquire it. And then I take that and I give that to sales. And then they use it in their sales calls. And then it also appears in the copy. So this hook has lived through the entire cycle of the book and makes it from you all the way to the reader. So it's there for the entire life. So again, you really need this hook because you need to be able to stand out against all the other books that are out there. And I have two kind of examples for this. So, story idea. The heroine is at a crossroads in her life. She meets a mysterious, tortured, wealthy, and sexually dominant hero who opens her eyes to passion. The two undergo a breathless romance, and his whole world begins to circle around her. Now, if I asked you right now to guess what book this was, you would probably have a couple examples in mind. And the more you thought about it, you would have a couple more, and then a couple more, until finally you realize, yeah, this could be a lot of books. And as with a lot of great hooks, or even not great hooks, just hooks in general, at some point they were strong enough to really catch someone's eye and really work. And then there were a lot of iterations off of that idea. There were a lot of books that were similar. And then it stops becoming something that can really move a book. And this next example I have tends to hit very close to home to a lot of contemporary romance authors. Story idea. The heroine had left her small town. 10 years later, she's back because A, her loved one died, leaving her a house she plans to refurbish and or sell into a bed and breakfast, or B, she got divorced and lost her job. She runs into her high school sweetheart or her longtime crush or the one who got away, and old sparks reunite. This is a very familiar and common setup for a contemporary small town romance. It is not a must-have hook. You need more than this. You need to add to it. And I know that a lot of you are thinking, well, say like a Debbie Maycomer and Susan Mallory, they do this wonderfully and they sell great. My answer to that would be yes, but at that point, Susan Mallory and Debbie Maycomer themselves are the hook. So Susan Mallory is so established and so beloved that her name sells the book. Nora Roberts' name sells the book. It almost doesn't matter what she's writing. If you are at the beginning of your career, or if you're at kind of the young mid-list, you really need to be thinking about what else can you add to your story to kind of attract more attention. What else can you add? It's that yes and. So jokingly, I like to call it yes and. He's a small town sheriff surviving the apocalypse. I'm not actually recommending you add zombies to all your small towns, though, that would be fun if you want to do that. I'd be open to reading those. But you have to be thinking of what else can I add to this small town book, or erotic romance book, or romantic suspense, or historical fiction, or whatever you're writing, that is going to make it something that really stops someone in their tracks and go like, oh, that's a book that I really want to read. And I do want to go back briefly to kind of highlight that 10 years later part. Now, I'm not coming after you with this, but everyone always makes it 10 years. A heroine or hero leaves and they come back 10 years later every single time. And just saying, as an editor, if you can make it 11 years or 9 years, even that would be different enough. So, some bad news. The number of books is rapidly increasing. The shelf space at our major resellers are rapidly decreasing. So there are a ton more books and there are a ton fewer places in print to sell them. And the tools for online discoverability are becoming less and less effective, while the average household amount of money spent on books is staying exactly the same. So there are a ton of books coming out, there's a lot of competition, but the average household is not spending more on these new books. So the competition has just increased exponentially. So this chart gives you kind of a good view of the number of book titles available to purchase in the United States. And the first one, we have Kindle titles that were added in 1 year. We had 1 million Kindle titles alone were added in a single year. At that point, all the Kindle titles numbered 5 million books. And then all Amazon US book codes, so that is all books, not just Kindle books. Every single book that had an ISBN was 62 million. So if you think about it that way, your competition is over 62 million books. That's the number that you've got to punch through in order to get your audience. So good news is that there was some research done, and readers were asked what drove them when they bought their last book, what was in their heads. And we see that 30% said that it was totally an impulse purchase. They were basically just walking along the store and oops, suddenly there was the next Lisa Kleypas in their bag. 23% said they planned to buy a specific book at a specific time. So this person either went online or got in their car and went to the store and picked up the next Lisa Kleypas. Then we had 23%, they planned to buy that specific book, but not at that specific time. So they just happened to be browsing somewhere, or they happened to be online buying something else and decided, well, now's the time to get that book that I've been wanting. And 26% planned to buy at a specific time, but not a specific book. These were the browsers. They were just going through the shelves. They were just at the library. They were browsing online, and this book caught their eye, and they decided to go ahead and buy it. So they wanted a book, they just didn't know which one it was. And the reason that this is significant is that it means that nearly 60% of these book sales were impulse buys. And that is your opportunity to really have your book be heard. They were also asked what factor influenced their decision the most, what made them decide to buy the book. So we had a book message at 31%, author series at 26%. So that's like the Nora Roberts or the Lisa Kleypas or the Marie Benedicts. Like, people just know they need that next book. 50% recommendations from friends, 8% special price. These are the price promos that used to really drive sales, especially online in the early days. Unfortunately, at 8%, that is no longer as effective as it once was. Reader reviews at 5%, news, reviews, and interviews at 5%, and other at 10%. So out of this whole pie, there are only 2 areas that you as an author and your publisher can control. That special price, which again, 8% and going down every year, that's not something you really want to bet on. And book message, that's where the hook lives. So a series hook. The reason you need a series hook, and this is especially relevant if you're writing genre fiction. If you're writing fiction that goes on the fiction shelf, they work a little bit different, but genre fiction does tend to buy in multiples. So as a romance editor, I would buy 3 books within a single series, and I'm looking for an overarching series hook. Same thing with horror. I might be looking for 2 books that are tied together in a way so that once readers gobble up the first book, they are moving on immediately to the next one. And that is a fantastic way to build an author career and momentum. But with a series hook, if you're writing this series, where in book 1, the brother runs to Montana to start a ranch, you're writing a cowboy romance. So if you're writing that book, I would say, okay, you're probably going to have your largest number of sales in the mass market. It's probably going to look a certain way. So here's kind of the different cover shoots we might want to talk about. Here are the different kind of ways that it might be titled. Here are kind of the words that we've noticed really work in PR and marketing. Here are the different kind of outreaches we'll do. Here are the blurbers we should reach out to. Here's your audience. Great. We get you established, you're writing cowboy romance, everything's going great. Your second book, the sister's on the run from the mob. Well, suddenly, you're no longer writing cowboy romance, you're writing romantic suspense. And you have a very different positioning. You have a very different audience. You have a very different place where you're going to see the most amount of sales. So you've suddenly kind of lost that momentum that you were getting with book 1 as you shift quickly into book 2. In book 3, the sister remains in a small southern town and falls in love with the local sheriff. Well, this sister has found herself in a contemporary small town romance, and that again is a very distinct look and a very distinct market. And then by the time we reach the 4th book, where the brother's a billionaire with a taste for BDSM, you're writing erotic romance, and you have lost your audience at every step along the way because you haven't found that through line that connects them. Nothing is really tying these books together in any way except for family, and family does not equal a compelling series hook. Now, I know that you're immediately thinking of exceptions to this, and again, like I said before, every rule can be broken. It just needs to be broken thoughtfully. So if you're thinking, well, I read the hell out of the Brenda Jackson family romances, I would agree, and I pick up anything by Brenda Jackson. But again, her name is the hook at this point. She's Brenda Jackson. So her name is what's selling this book, not necessarily like her series hook. So if you're a younger author, if you're a younger mid-list, you really need to think about what else you can add to it. So an example of how to take your single book into that series hook could go like this. So you're writing a book, you have this great idea for a single book, and you're told by either your agent or someone like me or your millions of fans that, hey, we want more. What are you going to do? You've got an amnesiac former Navy SEAL helps a beautiful scientist foil an Armageddon plot to poison Chicago's water supply. To take that, you just broaden it out. A small band of former Navy SEALs work together to track down the mad scientist who stole their memories, uncovering a shocking global conspiracy along the way. So it's when you're asked to take a book hook and expand it out into a series hook, it's more about iterating on that core idea. So you're keeping that core hook in place through all 3 of them, and you're going in 3 different directions. And the way my former colleague Kat Klein used to think of it, it was as a closet. She would say the series hook is the spine, concept, or theme that runs through these books. And again, as a genre fiction editor, we often buy 3 books. We're looking for that breakout series. A real life example of something that we bought was Bad Bachelor. So the book hook is, according to Bad Bachelors, the review app of New York City's eligible men, PR hack Reed McMahon is the baddest of the bad. Determined to fix his reputation, Reed works to polish his image and runs smack dab into trouble when a take-no-bull librarian is just as determined to stand in his way. The way this expanded out into the series is that we had the full League of Bad Bachelors. Everyone's talking about the hot new app reviewing New York's most eligible bachelors. But why focus on Prince Charming when you can read the dirt on the lowest ranked bad bachelors, New York City's most notorious bad boys? So as you can see, she had a core idea for a book, and then when she was asked to kind of iterate on that idea, she expanded this world so it still contained that theme of this app for the bad bachelors and all the girls of New York City writing about their terrible dates and the ranking and having a good time of it, and then the guys who are kind of impacted about it and what their response is. It can get even simpler than that, however. You can even have a high concept hook that's just a series of words thrown together. So the one in the middle is like wonderfully tropey in the way it's titled and positioned. It's cowboys, it's firefighters, it's Christmas. You got it. That is an instant mass success. On the right, we have Highland Dragons. That's the way that it was sold to us. This was, again, years ago, and then it became a huge trend, and lots of people started writing Highland Dragons. So if someone were to pitch me Highland Dragons now, that concept wouldn't be quite as appealing as it was several years ago when we found this book and it like really took off. And then my favorite example is Wolf Rising with the Special Wolf Alpha team. And in this, Dallas's SWAT team has a furry little secret. All right, so now that we've kind of covered hooks and series hooks, we're going to quickly touch on frames and why they're useful. So again, frames are the this plus this equals jazz hands. So if you tell me my book is Pretty Woman plus the Terminator, it gives me a pretty good idea of what you're going for with that book. Likewise, if you say my book is Dirty Dancing meets Pride and Prejudice, it sticks in my mind. It makes me think like, oh, well, that's really interesting. It's simple and impactful, and it gets me in kind of the frame of your book and the frame of your world. So then I'm more likely to remember it and be more perceptive for when you give me the hook. So this can be used when you're writing your back cover copy if you're independently published, or it could be used when you're doing PR marketing. It's often used at conferences. This is something that I often get when I'm hearing pitches. People will come to me and tell me like, my book's Pretty Woman plus the Terminator by way of Brenda Jackson, say, and then that kind of gives me a worldview in which like, all right, I kind of get what you're doing. The good parts about this is that it can work. So Sarah Megabo is a very wonderful, very powerful agent in the industry. And what she said in her tweet here pretty much sums it up. Succinct pitch equals powerful. Example, Song of Blood and Stone by El Penelope was pitched to me as Romeo and Juliet meets The Return of the King. So El Penelope reached out to Sarah Megabo, gave her that pitch, and then that frame was kind of what caught her interest and caught her memory. The book came in, she loved it, it got published, and it is fantastic. You should absolutely read El Penelope just anytime. The downside of a frame is that you really need to follow up on the promise of that frame. So if you were to pitch me Romeo and Juliet meets the Terminator, but there's really nothing about the Terminator in there, it's just kind of there to catch my interest, then your book comes in disappointing. Even if it would have been a sell for me before, even if it would have been fantastic, just because you got my expectations at a certain place and then you kind of let me down. You don't want to give any chances to let someone down in that way. So when you're choosing your frames, be really careful and really mindful about what you're choosing. Not only making sure that it's popular enough that most people know it. If you're using a frame that's quoting a pretty obscure movie or a pretty obscure show or something like that, then you're pretty much just wasting words and space at that point, because if people aren't going to get it, then it's not going to do what you want. But also, if you tell me that your book is Jurassic Park meets Pride and Prejudice and there are no dinosaurs, I'm going to be really sad that there are no dinosaurs, and then I'm probably going to be less inclined to be really receptive to this book as I'm reading it. So just keep that in mind as you're working with frames. All right, so now we're heading into what is kind of a difficult conversation for a lot of authors, and that's career. So an author's career arc, a lot of authors can be super prolific and they jump subgenres and they kind of follow the muse in a way. And this can be like wonderful. That kind of drive is what makes books truly authentic and truly wonderful. But it can be difficult if you're starting out in your career to build an audience, if you're continually shifting what you're doing. This is true across all fiction, but it's especially true in genre fiction, because genre fiction readers tend to be super voracious readers. So once they have read one book, they often want to read the next book, the next book, and the next book very fast, especially if they're romance fans. Romance and horror readers are the most voracious readers, and they will gobble up everything that you have. So if you are, say, writing a contemporary romance, and then your second book's a historical romance, and your third book's a romantic suspense, even if they're disconnected, even if it's not like our example before where they're supposed to be a series, you're kind of getting chances to lose your audience every way you go. So you really need to be thinking about, how am I going to, in the early parts of my career, build an audience so that people will follow me. And a kind of macabre way that I describe this is that imagine your energy and creativity and just time as a pitcher of water, and you've got 5 glasses in front of you. If you pour your pitcher of water into 2 glasses, then you have one completely full glass and one glass that's mostly full. That is a very full, rich career. If you spread that same pitcher of water into 5 glasses, none of your glasses are going to be full. You're going to struggle in your career. You're going to struggle to really launch it. Another example that's a little bit less focused on the macabre is, imagine I am a huge fan of Pink Floyd. I love their music. I love everything they do. I buy everything they do. And I hear that their next album's about to drop. So I get my wallet ready because I'm super excited. And it drops, and it's pop music. And I don't have anything against pop music, but I really wasn't following Pink Floyd for pop music. So I'm a little bit confused by this. But you know, they're really creative and I love their sound. So okay, I'm gonna go along with it for now. We'll see what happens. Next album drops and it's punk. Also not against punk, but that's kind of a strange move. That's not what I was expecting from them and not what I loved about them. And then the next album drop and it's country. And now I'm very alienated because I'm not really a huge country fan. And then they release gospel and I'm completely lost. I'm no longer a Pink Floyd fan. I don't really follow them. I might still keep their old albums because I love what they used to do, but I don't know what they're going to be doing because I'm not really kind of in that world anymore. I'm not like keeping my ear to the ground for Pink Floyd news. So even if they circled around and they went back to what I originally rabidly loved about them, I won't know about it and I won't listen to it and I won't buy it because they've lost me along the way. They've spent too much time bouncing between things that were too different from the core of what drew me to them in the first place. So that is just something to keep in mind, especially if you're in that early stage in your career where you're really launching yourself, is that you need to build that audience loyalty before you start experimenting. And even when you experiment, really keep a mindful eye on how you're doing it to make sure that there's a thread there that your fans can follow. And I have some case studies that I'm going to go into. One that shows genre, one that shows hook, and one that shows that career. So case study number 1 is focused on genre. We're looking at the Kingmaker Chronicles. So this is a question, can I cross genres? And the answer is yes, you absolutely can cross genres, but you need to be careful and mindful. Make sure you have the information, make sure you have the data, and make sure you have the right partners to help you do it so that you can provide very clear signals to your readers so they know what your book is and that this is a book that they want to have. So here's an example of the acquisitions positioning that was done by my former colleague Kat when she was acquiring Amanda Boucher. And one of the really important things to note is at the end where it says the agent says this sits on the romance shelf, but is this out of our wheelhouse? Is it really a romance, is what Kat was asking, because this was in kind of that nebulous space and there weren't a lot of comps. And in publishing, comps are everything. So our primary challenge was, how do we sell this? So what Kat did was she started digging deep into what the different genres that would be crossing here did and what they did well, and then used that to kind of reverse engineer how we should publish this book. So she looked at fantasy, and then she defined it as higher epic. The primary characteristics, a bit epic in length. It was usually a little bit more violent. There's often some kind of quest that's its driving focus. And the emphasis really isn't on the romantic elements. There can be romance there, but the romance isn't the driving force behind it. Urban fantasy was an interesting case because it was often shelved in fantasy, but it sometimes found its way on the romance shelf because it has a lot in common with romance. In this, we have a more urban setting. We have paranormal beings like vampires, shifters, demons, etc. It's often in first-person point of view. There's often a very strong romantic element, but it continues over many books, and sometimes it's not an in-game romantic element. So you think of examples of like Cat Daniels or things like that, like where you have a heroine who might not necessarily end up with the person that you think is her romantic interest. And then you have paranormal romance. This is always shelved in romance with very few exceptions. And this is where the romance is central to the story arc. The romance is the special sauce that's pushing it along. It tends to have a different hero and heroine in each book. It tends to have a third person alternating point of view. Again, that focus on paranormal beings, and often a suspense element with, when I say less emphasis on world building, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a rich world. These books absolutely have rich worlds. It just means that the romance is that kind of 60% or more that I was talking about, and the world building becomes like the 40%. So it is very important, but it is not the dominant element the way that it is in a high fantasy. So what we did was then we looked at this time Nielsen, and this was in the week ending 8/30, so 2015. So this was when she was looking at acquiring this book. And she looked at the top 50 all formats romance and the top 50 all formats fantasy. So what you're seeing on the left are the romance, and what you're seeing on the right are the fantasy. And what we did was then we compared the 1 week sale of the fantasy to the 1 week sale of the romance. So if you look at the very top, we have Wildest Dreams. In 1 week, it sold 30,389 books. So that's what the TW sales mean. It means this week's sales. So 30,000 books, really good. We look in the fantasy side, we have A Game of Thrones by a very familiar author. In 1 week, that book sold 1,777 copies. So the number one book in fantasy sold just shy of 2,000. The number one book in romance sold over 30,000. That is a huge difference. Draw your eyes down to the very bottom, we have the number 50 books. So this is kind of the top 50, so we're at the very bottom. That week, Knight's Surrender, in 1 week, it sold 2,165 in romance. So the 50th book, the bottom of this kind of snapshot, sold over 2,000 copies in 1 week. That's more than the number one book on the fantasy side. The number 50 book in 1 week in fantasy sold 347 copies. So that was what we were looking at when we were deciding if we wanted to shelve it in fantasy or shelve it in romance. We kind of had to get a measure of what this book actually was and where it really fit and where its kind of heart and soul and readership was. But we also had to look really hard at the opportunity. And the opportunity was telling us that really romance was the place to go. If you see those bright blue boxes that are along the sides, that is showing that this book showed up for the first time on the week or on the list that week. So in romance, you see quite a lot of blue boxes. And on the fantasy side, you're seeing 2. So what that tells us is that there's a lot of movement in romance, and there's almost no movement in fantasy. So in fantasy, when a book hits, it lands on that top part and it stays there. And it tends to just stick around for a really, really, really long time. Whereas romance, there's kind of a constant kind of change when who's on top, who's new, who's just come out with a book, who had like this big sticky book that just came out, Red, White, and Royal Blue suddenly lands, the Kiss Quotient suddenly lands, and then they rise to the top. So there's a lot of movement and momentum on romance. There's not a lot in fantasy. So we knew that when we were launching a debut, if we really wanted to get her on this top of these lists, we were looking at more of a romance opportunity. Now, lest any fantasy fans start to get really sad and decide to walk away right now, I do want to say that fantasy has something going for it that romance does not, and that's called the long tail. Basically, romance, it hits hard, it hits fast, it has a lot of sales in really, really quick time. And then after a certain amount of time, like say 4 months, we see sales trickle down and the weekly sales become really low. Whereas the fantasy side, if you land and you hit big, your book can stick around for a really, really long time and sell less per week than romance, but for a longer period of time. So it has a long sales tail. And if you become a really big author like George R.R. Martin or Patrick Rothfuss, you will have multiple books that are choking up the top lists. So that's just something to keep in mind, how those two behave very differently. So in conclusion, we looked at fantasy, we looked at romance, we kind of weighed the two and went, okay, definitely romance. So how do we do this? We really wanted to make sure that we put it in romance, but really talk to the fantasy reader. So in order to do that, we were thinking, all right, it's paranormal romance, like I said, with the umbrella, but it's going to be under the fantasy romance subgenre. But it crosses over to the fantasy readers. We want to make sure that a fantasy reader wants to pick it up. So what we did was we thought of the titles. The titles needed to have something a bit epic to them, but they also needed to sound romantic. So we have fire, that's kind of a sexy word, and then like breath and heart. Those are things that really resonate with a romance reader. But the series title is right down the middle fantasy. It's the Kingmaker Chronicles. You can't get more fantasy than that. The cover was very heroine-centric to kind of give that connection to the romance reader, but it has a strong emphasis on the world. It's building that fantasy world out for the fantasy reader. And then Dorinda Jones, God bless her, she's amazing, came to us with an amazing blurb that really put the nail on this coffin. Fantasy romance at its finest. She defined the book for people. It's right there on the front. When they see it, they know, romance readers know that this is for them. Fantasy readers also know that this can be for them. We were careful in the back cover copy that it really spoke to that fantasy and romance reader, but also showed a little bit of lightheartedness, because this book has a lighter tone than what you would see in some epic fantasies. And it did incredibly well. Amanda Boucher is one of the names in fantasy romance because of this. All right, hook. Case study, Rocky Mountain Romantic Suspense. So this is what I shared for Katie Ruggles' Rocky Mountain Romantic Suspense with the acquisition team. And I really focused in on kind of what it was, why Katie Ruggles. She's an experienced cop survivalist expert. She's a debut author. And then this is an area in the Rocky Mountains where rescue groups, law enforcement, rescue divers, firefighters are often the only hope for the lost, the sick, and the injured. And then I talked about how each book focuses on a different member of this group. So we have this great band of brothers element. So in book 1, it focuses on the rescue diver. Book 2, motorcycle club member turned firefighter. Book 3, a survivalist expert wilderness guide. And book 4 is a cop. That continued on after acquisitions into our sales materials. So we have in the remote wilderness of the Rocky Mountains, rescue groups, law enforcement, rescue divers, firefighters are often, et cetera, exactly what you heard when you're looking at acquisitions. And then in the second paragraph, it goes straight into book 1's kind of focus and hook. So sales marketing received this information when they were selling the book. covers also received this information. We had lots of talks with our cover designer and artist about how it's about survival against the elements and killers, the creeping feeling that you're being hunted, man versus wild, and they went in a very elemental kind of feel because this book was very much about that wilderness survival experience. And then for the reader, the hook translated all the way down to the back cover copy. So as you see at the very top of it, we actually give part of the series hook as a bit of a nugget so the reader, when they pick it up and flip it over, can see exactly what this book is. In the remote Rocky Mountains, lives depend on the search and rescue brotherhood, but a place this far off the map, trust is hard to come by, and secrets can be murder. And then we go into the actual copy. So this top of the book was on all 4 of the books. So it is the series hook promise to the reader. This is what you're getting with this book. The reader response was absolutely fantastic. It was huge. People loved this book. Just a couple of small authors you might have heard of discovered it in the wild and fell in love with Katie and her books and gave us really fantastic blurbs. And Katie has taken this amazing first hook and has created a career off of it. She's essentially iterated off of this core kind of brand that she's created. And she's got multiple series now that cover everything from the original Search and Rescue to the Canine Cups to Bounty Hunter Sisters. She's going to have a cozy mystery series that's kind of related to this. She's looking at Private Eyes, Dispatchers, Hostage Negotiators. So they each have their own kind of distilled hook and idea, but they all have that kind of world that she's created. And she herself as a name is starting to become a hook onto herself. So the third and final example is the career, and we're using Men of Honor. Now, I am not giving an author name for this. I do have her permission to talk about this, but it is an actual acquisition that came in that we did acquire. But this author, when she sent me her book, her most popular books often featured men and women with very strong moral compass. She had everyday heroism. It was all about that wonderful found family, and she had a lot of caretaker alphas that were strong feminists themselves. These books were incredible. They were feminists. They were really just enjoyable for everyone to read. Her submission to me featured mobster hero and heroines, violence that was committed by the heroes, very rigid social structures, and the alphas were kind of jerks. They were not very nice to the people in their lives. They were not very good to heroines or sister figures or anyone else. They were just kind of alpha holes. And I sat down with her and I said, you know, I really love your writing and I love your books, but what you're sending me is something completely different than what your audience loves about you. And I don't know if this is a great idea for your career. And thankfully, she was really receptive to that idea and kind of had an aha moment. And we were talking about it. And the important thing to come out of that is when you're starting this new series or you're starting a change in your career, you're starting to write in a different subgenre or genre, you really need to ask yourself, who is your core audience? Why do they read you? What experience do they expect? And if you manage to figure that out and you manage to answer that with your new book, even if it's a completely different subgenre, even if it's something just absolutely worlds away different from what you became known for, if you deliver that experience, readers will still follow you. If you don't know where to start, best place to check is your reviews. Your reviews will often note the things that really kind of caught their attention and really made them love you in the first place. So with this author example, after sitting down and kind of tossing it around, she came back with a new series that had a lot of the themes that she really wanted to explore with that series she submitted to me, but had kind of twisted it back away from that really kind of uber alpha, uber dark, kind of unpleasant experience, and really made it like about caretaker alphas, found family, powerful woman, heroic. These were the power words that she found when we were looking through our reviews. And so she was able to introduce completely new characters, a completely new world, a new series, but she was still delivering that same reading experience to the fans within that same subgenre in that example. But also, if she were to cross over into a very different, she would still be able to give them what they were looking for. So, to recap, Hook is 1 to 3 sentence essence of the story. This is the must read because. The series hook is the unifying factor of all the books. It's especially important in genre. And then we have low concept hook and high concept hook. Easier to sell a high concept hook. If you find yourself with a low concept hook, dig deep and find where that high concept hook is hiding, because that's what's going to connect you with your readers. That's what's connect you with the publisher if you're looking to traditionally publish. Okay, so now I think Stephanie is going to step in and help me with questions.
Hello. Okay, so we've got a couple pretty straightforward ones. So where did your numbers come from for your real examples of distribution slide?
The real examples of distribution came from our own internal information. So you notice that I didn't include the titles or the authors. Obviously that's important, but we were looking at some of our own books, and we're looking at the books of our competitors, and we're kind of like checking our own records, checking book track at that time, checking sorry, I just like lost the word for what it was. I'm checking this system called Tips. We were basically checking the different places that we as the publisher have access to see where these books sold.
What are the differences between hooks for traditional and indie titles? Are they marketed differently?
The hooks for traditional titles, it really depends on where you're looking to sell that traditional title. So a traditional mass market title, so we're thinking like the Walmart book, the big box store, the Sam's Club. This isn't a rule. Again, there are always going to be exceptions, but those do tend to have like a certain small town feel. They tend to like those small towns. They like the Sharon Salah's Blessing Georgias. They really like cowboys and like that kind of warm connection and family. They like their Carrie Lindells, which are a little bit less about the warm connection family and more about kind of the action and life of being actually in the rodeo circuit, but still has that real focus on how people connect together. So I would say if you're going mass market, to look more into that kind of contemporary space, or Regency is also starting to really pick up there. If you're looking to really sell strong and independent, or say Target, then right now the hooks that seem to be working are the really super high concept kind of rom-com-y style. These are the books like The Kiss Quotient and books like Boyfriend Material are really kind of working there. When you're talking about independent publishing, it really depends on the niche that you're trying to fill. Independent publishing is wonderful because it means that there are just like millions upon millions upon millions of different kind of avenues that you can take and shape your career. And you can kind of see very fast what's working. Publishing tends to be a little bit slower in the trends in the subgenre cycle at a slower pace because it's hitting a bigger wide stream audience. But if you're doing independent publishing, you can kind of pay attention to what's happening on a micro level and say like, all right, everyone's writing about this right now, or I'm seeing this is happening in like the air in the market. And so those kind of hooks tend to like winnow that way, that you can kind of like keep your pulse on that. I hope that made sense. That felt rambly.
That goes great into our next question, which is how often do you find that new trends come up? Does it follow news, shopping seasons?
New trends come up very, very quickly in independent publishing. You will see like, oh, tattoo romances, and then like 2 weeks later, no, it's motorcycles, and 2 weeks later, no, it's mobsters, and it just like really happens very fast. Traditional publishing doesn't tend to happen on that immediate, like patter, 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 everything has to happen immediately kind of space. Because publishing, it takes longer to actually get the books created and then get the books sold in, because our buyers are actually buying the books way, way out to order to shelve them. Those trends tend to slow down. So you're able to kind of see them slowly form and crystallize and change. And then one book will just come along and smash everything. So you'll be building, 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 and then suddenly, oh, look, there's red, white, and royal blue. And then that changes the avenue of everything. So, kind of answer that, it's like a very, very fast on one side. So if you're a super, super, super fast author, you can really like do well in that kind of like quick churn and trend. Or if you're kind of either a slower author or you're looking for kind of to build like a slower step, the traditional publishing does cycle with its trends, but it cycles at kind of a slower pace.
Who or what determines those trends?
Readers determine the trends. People often call publishers the gatekeepers. I think that's a bunch of BS. Like, I'm not keeping a gate for anyone. I buy books that I have proof that they'll sell. And if I don't have proof that they'll sell and I'm in love with the book, I desperately look for a way to prove that this one will sell. And so the reader is ultimately the one who they either find and buy the book, or they find the book and they pass on it. And if they find the book and they pass on it, even though I thought that this like art heist was going to be the next big thing, if I'm the only one that's in love with art heists and con men and I can't get readers to also be into it, no matter how hard I as an editor and how hard our PR team and how hard the agents and how hard our partners at B&N and other places really try to make it work, if readers aren't buying it, it doesn't become a trend.
Going back to the pie charts on where genres sell, what about historical romance? What does that pie chart look like? Print, ebook, mass, etc.
Historical romance is a really interesting one because it is having what I would call the beginnings of a renaissance. So historical romance used to be the big thing years ago, and it was the big genre that sold everywhere. And if you were writing contemporary romance, you found it very difficult to sell your books because everyone was buying historical. And then that kind of trended down, and then actually paranormal was what came in and took its place, and then contemporary took its place, and now rom-com has taken its place. So historical got kind of pushed down and became extremely hard to buy for quite a while. And even though there were agents, editors, and readers who loved it, it was just a glutted market. There was a lot of it, and it was hard to get it in. But something that's been happening is that that cycle has been moving up again. So historicals, we're seeing a lot more movement for them. We're seeing a lot more interest in them. And we're seeing that kind of movement happen a lot in the mass market, which is a very promising. So something I just mentioned was answering another question, is that historical, especially Regency, sexy Regency specifically, is seeing a lot of movement in that space. And it also had some movement in ebooks, hit or miss kind of in the indies. It depends on what you're doing with it. And hit or miss also with the retail. It kind of depends on the book.
All right, we've got a question that says, I have a book that crosses 2 romance subgenres. Easy to put in a query, but a lot of agents have a drop-down menu. How do I know which to pick?
Well, that is difficult. When you're forced to pick one, what I would do in that case is kind of figure out what your sister books are, figure out what your comps are. So look at a book that is, even though it's not going to be identical to yours, that it's the closest fit, and decide to go in that subgenre as your number one subgenre. And then when you're talking about your hook later on, mention that it does cross over into this other subgenre. So if it is, say, a Regency romance with a very strong romantic suspense drive, I would kind of imagine, all right, a romantic suspense reader is probably less likely to want to read a Regency romance if they're not already in love with Regency romance. Whereas a Regency romance reader, because that is so specific, is more likely to be willing to read a romantic suspense. So I would think of it that way. I'd probably put it in Regency in that case, and I would kind of like just double check other books that have that kind of cross between historical and romantic suspense to make sure that the ones that feel the most like my books are also published in that way.
Melissa says she is part of a writing duo. They're writing a rom-com which includes a blog. Their heroine has 3 roommates and they want to do a series, but the follow-ups will not include the blog. Can that still work, or would you call it a spin-off?
That could work if you find what the connective tissue is between these books other than the fact that they're roommates, unless the fact that they're roommates is something that's interesting in and of itself. So if there's something that makes it interesting and unique and kind of like hooky that they're roommates, that could be your series hook. But if they just happen to be roommates, I think you might struggle to find that connective tissue, and you might want to like look to see what else you can pull out that will really connect these 3 books.
Marcy says, if I want to pitch a series of 3 books, but the first book is novella length, would it be better to query with book 2, lengthen book 1, or question mark, question mark, question mark?
Novellas tend to be very difficult to sell to traditional publishers. We don't I can't speak for all traditional publishers, I should say, but speaking for Sourcebooks, we don't tend to buy and publish novellas on their own. When we have novellas, they are generally a free introductory story, or they're a marketing tool. So if this novella sets up the series in a way that readers absolutely have to read that novella in order to understand book 2, I would highly recommend either reworking it so that readers don't have to read that novella in order to really get into the world as if book 2 was actually book 1, or lengthen that novella and make it a full book.
Sarah is asking, where do tropes fit into hooks? Are tropes also considered a shared language slash shorthand when using hooks, like Band of Brothers or Enemies to Lovers? Or can a hook live on its own without a trope being mentioned?
A hook can absolutely live on its own without a trope being mentioned. Tropes do lend a lot to hooks, but it's really tricky because there are certain tropes that are used so much at a certain point that they no longer have that kind of stickiness anymore. So Band of Brothers is actually a good example of that term has been thrown around so much in acquisitions rooms and sales rooms within like these last couple of years, as romantic suspense kind of had its big hop, that it's not on its own quite as hooky. Whereas like right now, this is also me talking like personally what I love, so some of that's influencing us. But if you say Grumpy Sunshine, Forced Proximity, my ears perk up. I'm real interested. So you don't have to have the tropes in a hook. A hook stand very strongly alone, but tropes, especially tropes where you happen to like either luck into like that perfect match, or you're using a trope that hasn't been overused and overblown recently, can really help.
How would a hook fit into a query? Would you put it into your opening email or weave it into the summary?
In the query, I would put it at the very beginning. The hook is the most important thing. We need to know title of the book, how long the book is, and the hook. And then any kind of author information that you've got. So if you've got a track record, share your track record, share your sales. If you don't have a track record, don't worry about it. You don't have to include that information. But the most important things are title, length. Oh, is it complete? That's very important too. And that hook. So I would put that near the very top.
So that goes into a couple questions that I'm going to put together. Do you need a book proposal to pitch to you, and do you need an agent to pitch to you?
To me specifically, you do not need an agent. We accept unaged inquiries at Sourcebooks, and I am open to queries. If it comes to me and I feel like it might not be the perfect fit for me, what I might do is then forward it to our editorial team. We have submissions at sourcebooks.com, and every single week the editorial team gathers together and looks through the submissions and talks about them and reads them. So they are getting touched by multiple editors. You do need a book in order to pitch to me. If you are just kind of sending me an idea, all I can really say is, that sounds like a great idea. Why don't you write it? So I really can't offer anything until you actually have something to show me.
A couple of questions asking you to define certain subgenres. So what defines the women's fiction / romance subgenre?
That is a tricky question. So women's fiction is a subgenre and genre unto itself that is shelved in two very distinct places. So it could be anything from, say, the Cheryl Woods, or like Sharon Sala sometimes writes, or Carolyn Brown is a good example of women's fiction, some of her books, that is romantic. And it is, the romance is a really driving element, and it sits on the romance shelf. It tends to have a very strong romantic plot, but the plot is not strong enough that it overtakes the other elements. So it's again that kind of percentages thing, and it's an inexact science, but instead of being like 60-70% romance in a strong romantic women's fiction, it might be like a 40-50 or 45, somewhere in there, and then it would sit on the romance shelf. And not always, but it would tend to have like a very warm and inviting cover. It would have like a very warm and inviting title. It just like exudes warmth, and the rest of the story deals a lot with that kind of character's journey, her relationship with her parents or her siblings or sisters. Jill Chavez has been doing really strong romantic women's fiction with her Lemon Sisters series, and it's kind of like that three friends go to a beach to talk about their lives, and then one of them, who'd been recently divorced and is dealing with the fallout of the divorce and her children's reaction to the divorce, finds that perfect hunky guy on the beach, and then they have a romantic story and a happily ever after that takes up like 45% of the book. That would be romantic women's fiction. Women's fiction that goes on the fiction shelf can have very strong romantic elements, like Susanna Kearsley is a great example, but it's not, the romance isn't the overarching thing. And women's fiction on the fiction shelf also doesn't have to be happy. It can have very like deep emotional, tearful endings. It could be about many difficult topics, and it's again about the experience and relationships and just living a life as a woman. But even though the romance can be there as a part of it, it's not the overarching part. It's not really big, and there's not that guaranteed happy ending. So it's a different tone. So yeah, I hope that kind of explains. It's difficult to parse, but those are kind of the two, how we think of it as distinct.
These two questions kind of go together. Where would you place the subgenre romantic thrillers on the shelf? And then what about psychological thrillers? What's that market like?
I would put romantic thrillers in romance. We actually have a couple of romantic thrillers. We have Adriana Under's Whiteout series, The Survival Instinct. So that is a romantic thriller. We also have Juno Rushton's incredible series, Starting with Every Last Breath. That is a romantic thriller. The romance is a very big chunk of that book, so it goes on the romance shelf. If it was a book that was less of a romance, that the romance really wasn't as important and the thriller kind of took over, then we would have an example like our Amanda Boucher case study, where the author, the editor, and the agent really have to look at the numbers and look at where the opportunity is. And so you might look at like a Karen Rose and go like, okay, is it like this kind of book? Does it fit alongside there? If so, how is she publishing? And do we kind of want to sit cheek and gel with her? Or is the thriller element so strong that it really is a thriller with romantic elements, and then it should go on the thriller shelf? And in that case, you're looking at a completely different trim size. You're not going to be in mass market. You're probably going to be in trade paper or hardcover, and you're going to be published in a very different way. And I just nattered, so I forgot what the second part of that question was. Psychological thriller?
Yes.
Yes. So psychological thriller, that tends to sit kind of alongside the domestic thrillers in my experience. And I am not an expert in this field, so also take what I'm saying with a grain of salt at this point. But from what I'm seeing, those two tend to sit very cheek and jowl, the domestic and psychological. It's all about kind of that question of, is something really happening? Other people don't believe you, not trusting you, and it's very much in this character's head and in their experience. That does tend to fall on the thriller shelf.
All right, this one's kind of fun. My writing partner and I are writing a Scottish, not really time travel, but time cursed romance. How do we classify it? It's not time travel, but there's a curse. So is it paranormal?
Oh, that's interesting. Uh, Not really time travel, but a time curse. I would actually, what I would do is I would pick up a Susanna Kearsley time slip novel, and I would kind of read that and read a couple of her books and see if what you're writing feels a little bit like that, because her books are she has time slip often, which is not time travel. It's a very distinct thing, and it often has these paranormalish elements. Um, but the way that it's positioned and published is very much on the fiction shelf and published in a certain way. So if you read those books and you have that aha moment, realize that your book could sit alongside Susanna Kearsley, I would absolutely use her as a comp, for one, because she does incredibly well. And then two, I would use those kind of terminologies, like this is a time slip novel, a fiction book. I wouldn't mention the word romance unless you say with romantic elements. Because once you say it's a kind of paranormally romance, you kind of get people thinking in a certain way. They're going to be thinking like a mass market shifter book. And that does not sound like what your book is.
Couple of questions about what you look for personally. One, are you open to own voices? And would you ever be open to publishing a fiction book about mental health?
Yes, I am 1,000% open to own voices, and I would 1,000% be very open to publishing a book about mental health. When I am looking for books, I am, of course, looking for things that interest me and things that really kind of work with me, but also I have to keep in mind things that are working with the audience. So I've kind of got like two minds going every time I read a book. The things that I'm personally drawn to are, I really love LGBTQIA+, I really love own voices experiences. I really, really love forced proximity. I tend to be more of a wilderness girl than a city girl. So a lot of the books on my list tend to kind of nudge into, one of them is literally in Antarctica, if that answers that question. And the others are like lost in the wilds of the Rocky Mountains. I tend to be really drawn to those kind of stories. And I have very few stories that are actually set in a city setting, just because I lived in New York City for 10 years. I kind of lived it. I got burned out, didn't need to read about it. However, I also have that part of my mind that's thinking about what's really working for the audience and what's really working right now in the mass market versus the indies versus the trades versus et cetera, et cetera. So as I'm building my list, I'm trying to almost like I'm doing stock markets, where I have like, these are my kind of passion books and these are the things that I really wanted to buy into. And here are kind of the things that I really love this book, but it might not have had an element that immediately drew me to it. But I know who that reader is and I know how to sell it and I know how to work with this author. And I'm really excited to make this book really sing. So I also buy those books. I feel like I didn't answer part of that question though. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so.
Okay, good.
Um, okay, so a couple more classification ones. I have
hmm
a male-male baseball romance that has psychic players and is set in the near future, 2030. How do I classify this?
Oh, so once you throw in the near future and psychic, you need to lean more into the paranormal realm. It's kind of like that example that I was talking about with the historical fiction and historical romance and the romantic suspense, where the romantic suspense reader is not that likely to read a Regency book unless they also happen to love that, but the Regency reader is much more likely to read a suspense book woven into the Regency world that they love. Uh, that's the same case where it comes to paranormal elements if they're very, very strong. Um, Sometimes you can kind of get away with it if it's a light paranormal element and you can kind of pitch it more into the contemporary-ish side. But if it goes a little bit too hard into the futurism or too hard into that paranormalish element, that's really where you're going to have to live, because that it tends to be the more I don't want to call it a niche audience because it's not really niche, but that's more specific, and that's the kind of thing that the wider contemporary audience is a little bit less likely to immediately buy in on. So make that part clear.
What is the difference between a horror or, say, a paranormal mystery? I have a ghost slash haunting YA story.
A horror versus paranormal mystery. You know, it's really interesting you asked me this question because I have this author, Darcy Coates, and she is horror, is where we classify her. Uh, but she writes what we call optimistic horror. She writes essentially horror with a happy ending. So everything that she does, it's light, it's not super gory, it's very atmospheric, it's very chilling. She does haunted houses really, really well. But the things that happen to them are kind of slow creeps and chills and like the things that make you kind of curl up under your blanket, but not the things that like give you terrible nightmares or kind of disgust you. And they always end with following these kind of characters you like on a happy note. So we kind of discussed when she was first signed whether we're going to continue classifying her as horror or whether we're going to kind of look at a different classification. In the end, we decided to stay with horror because horror has kind of opened itself up as an umbrella term and is including more of those kind of crossover elements. Um, but again, like I mentioned before, I'd really kind of look at the shelves and I would look at what other authors are doing that's similar to your books, and I would look at the like what is the driving element of it and what other books are doing, where are they positioned, and if you find a book that feels very similar to yours that's positioned as thriller, then you can know that there's this kind of avenue open to you and that you should perhaps consider positioning it as thriller because there's an opportunity. Whereas if you find a book that's very similar to yours that's positioned as YA horror, that's where you'll want to go.
All right, I think this is our last question. We do have a few we didn't get to, but you guys are more than welcome to tweet Mary. She's got her information there, or tweet us. So the last question, if you are acquiring a book that has a hook that doesn't naturally fit the data you have, what do you use to come up with a pitch? Or rather, how do you decide what is the better angle? Is it basically decided on what will make it sell better?
So if I get a book in and I fall madly in love with it, but there's not an obvious hook or there's not an obvious path forward, like I don't have some great comps, I don't have kind of like that perfect kind of like, all right, I know immediately how to sell this, I know immediately where it goes, here's what the hook is, etc. That tends to be a very long, difficult, laborious process where I have conversations if there's an agent involved, if there's not, straight with the author as well, saying like, doing that work of like, okay, what are the books that are similar ish? What are those kind of books looking like? Then I look at what are the different markets for where this could cross over and fit. I start looking at the sales numbers like you saw before with the example of Promise of Fire. I start looking at what are kind of those week over week sales, how could this book kind of work in this market versus that market? What kind of positioning can I do? I actually have a whole workshop that's focused on just like positioning, taking these kind of sticky questions and like making that book kind of like work really well in this audience or work really well in this audience based on its title, its look, and how we're talking about it. I would, if it doesn't have like a really high concept hook, I would then like reading through the book kind of keep an eye on what are the things and themes that I think that I can help the author pull forward in edits so that we're able to give it a high concept hook. It is a ton of work and is work that your agent, your editor will absolutely do if they fall madly in love with your project. I also do need to say that editors and agents are incredibly overbooked, so don't bet on your book making them fall so madly in love that they're going to do that. We wish we could do that with every single book that crosses our path, but honestly, we can't. So just do the work yourself if possible. Read through it with your critique partners. Look for those hooks yourself. Try to pull it out. And then when you have a relationship with an agent or you reach out to an editor who's interested and they're kind of on the fence, just kind of like be open and working with them like, well, here are the other things I brainstormed. And if you kind of show me that you're also willing to do this kind of really hard work together, that you're open to do those kind of edits, kind of pull it forward, then I'm much more likely to take that risk and that chance to like really champion this project and really make that hook shine.
On that note, do you mind sharing what you're looking for right now and how people can get in contact with you?
Yeah, so I sign all subgenres of romance. I also sign into some mystery. I sign into YA and horror. So I'm a little bit all over the place. So I'll just give some examples of what I am most interested in right now in all. So in romance, I am, of course, rom-com is kind of kicking butt right now. Specifically, I am very interested in LGBTQIA plus rom-com. I am interested in those books that capture all corners of the rainbow. I am not just looking for one letter of the alphabet. I am very, very keen on all LGBTQI plus rom-com. It's important to me that the author is a member of the community. I don't ask for receipts there. You don't need to out yourself to me, but just kind of let me know if you're sending me a rom-com that's LGBTQI plus that you are in some way affiliated with community, and then I will take it on the honor system. But it's just important to me that we kind of have the own voices speaking out in that way, even though we would not use the term own voices when talking about it. Speaking of own voices, very, very interested in own voices books. Please send those to me. I am very hungry for them. I'm looking more into contemporary romance. I'm actually interested in small town romance, which is not something that I've had my door wide open for in the past, but it's something that I'm increasingly curious about, especially if there's something really unique about the small town or it's kind of a different kind of location. So like my colleague Deb Worksman has a really nice Alaska set or small town romance. Something like that would be really interesting to me. Um, I am super nerdy, so I am always up for some paranormal. So please send those my way. And again, I love those just across the board, Grumpy Sunshine and Forced Proximity. Those are like my two favorite tropes. So if you send me those, I will love it. I don't tend to be super into the uber alphas. Those don't tend to click with me very well. I like the gamma or beta heroes much, much more. Uh, Outside of romance, I'm looking for Southern fiction. My colleague Shanna Drays does this incredibly well. When it comes to the fiction shelf, I tend to like books that do things that are a little bit like slightly tilted to the side. They're slightly different. There's something unusual about them. So my colleague Grace, for example, purchased a book called The Seven and a Half Deaths of Eleven Hardcastle. That's amazing. That's the kind of book that I would be super into. Or Susanna Kearsley, who is one of Deb's authors. That's the kind of book that I would be super drawn to. On horror side, I am interested in all kinds of horror. I'm specifically interested in, I really like haunted houses. I really like that survivalist narrative. I'm a little bit less interested in like the woman is murdered on the first page kind of books. I really want really thoughtful feminist books. And I really, in places like horror, I'm open to everything, but I'm really looking for voices that you don't hear a lot of in this genre. So I'm really looking for authors of color, I'm looking for women authors, I'm looking for LGBTQIA authors. I'm just looking for something that their voices aren't perhaps the first thing that you hear when you hear horror. Instead, you hear Stephen King or Joe Hill. And with YA, I am more interested in kind of the older edges of YA. Actually, so Stephanie and I are looking to make new adult a thing again, talking about making trends. We're doing a lot of research into it in this year. We've got some books that we really, really think kind of thread that needle between YA and romance really well. And so we're really working hard in that kind of cross-genre space. And so if you've got projects that are kind of new adulty, I would be very interested in seeing those. So young adult, also older young adult though. If they're like 13, 14 years old, it's probably not for me. I'm looking more for the 16 and up kind of young adult. I really like the thriller and horror style young adult. Very much love the LGBTQIA plus young adult. I'm part of the community, so I'm really looking for like those voices as well. And so that's kind of an overview, a sprinkling of what I'm looking for. But basically, if a book comes in and it's a super high concept hook and it's really interesting, I'm gonna love it. So even if I didn't mention specifically what you're writing, send it to me anyway. Why not? And if it doesn't really work for me, I can pass it to like our full submissions team, and then you'll have like 5 other editors who are looking for it.
All right. Thank you so much for everyone that attended. Here's our contact information here, and we will send you the full recording hopefully next week if you would like to watch it again.
Yeah, and make sure you tweet about it. Steph, what's the hashtag?
Hashtag Casa Workshop.
Yay! All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day. Take care of yourself, and thanks for joining us.